set a table. I'm not aware of etiquette, and I certainly don't understand the rules of wearing white. I'm not elegant, cultured, or delicate, for that matter. Does that mean I'm not a lady? Of course not. It's 2012. The definition of being a lady has changed so frequently and dramatically throughout history that the exact definition is missing. Showing your ankles is no longer reserved for hookers like it was prior to 1910. Ladies attend college and hold jobs and are CEOs of Yahoo while pregnant, whereas Encyclopedia Britannica reports that the word lady was once reserved exclusively for the wives of British barons and knights. We now know that the British don't have a monopoly on ladies. In fact, we'll be focusing exclusively on ladies in North America. However, I'm not trying to convince you as to whether or not the term lady is relevant to our times. I'm simply going to educate you on its history. First, we'll take a look at the 19th century, what made a woman a lady then. Secondly, we'll look at the early 20th century and the classification for being ladylike. And we'll finish up with the late 20th century to today's definition of being a lady. Imagine you're dining at that fancy new restaurant and you look down at your table and see way too many forks and knives and spoons, so you think to yourself, who on earth would need this much silverware? But in the 19th century, a lady knew and understood each piece and its purpose. According to Ellen Plant in her book, Women at Home in Victorian America, this type of information was taught to young girls through manuals or pamphlets. They would tell her how a lady would go about things like social interaction, education, religion, and marriage. You see, when a girl was 16, she had men asking for her hand in marriage. The final decision, however, was typically left up to her parents. On marriage, Ellen Plant says that the advice books written for young ladies during the 1840s extolled the virtues of marriage in a mythical fashion. This was probably because after a woman was married, she was expected to have children almost immediately. This idea that because a woman can have kids, it's her job to have kids, is reflected in Sigmund Freud's famous quote, "Anatomy is destiny." And for Victorian ladies, it certainly was. They were meek, chaste, religious, and maternal. That is, however, until someone decided to challenge it. I bet most of your moms voted, or if you're over 18, you too. And I bet no one thought twice about it. That's a result of the early 20th century's suffragists. According to Catherine Gorley in her book, Gibson Girls and Suffragists, Alva Vanderbilt was one of the first ladies of polite society to divorce her husband and remarry. She went on to become a suffragist, even stating for the cause, "Just remember this, the home is not the only sphere for women by any means." This, coming from the mouth of polite society's queen, was what enabled the traditional lady of the 19th century to back the new ideas of the early 20th. This wealth of new support was what led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women and ladies the right to vote. Another woman who changed the definition of being a lady was Amelia Earhart. She was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean alone. But the reason the early 20th century viewed her as a revolutionary rather than a radical was the fact that she wore a skirt while flying. According to Catherine Szabo's book, Sky Pioneer, a biography of Amelia Earhart, this was because she wanted to retain her femininity while changing the world. Upon receiving voting rights and a new inspiration, women continued to challenge the expected, becoming flappers by cutting their hair, getting out of the Depression by rationing and organizing, and winning a war by working in factories. It seemed that there was a cycle. Each decade, women would shatter the previous definition of being a lady and see their efforts become the new norm in the next. This would continue throughout the early 20th century until a few major events of the latter half. Sex. It's perfectly natural, but for a while, husbands did it more than their wives, which if you think about it ought to be impossible. Today, The guidelines for being a lady are incredibly lax as a result of the late 20th century's free love, athleticism, and career women. According to Gail Collins' book, When Everything Changed, there were two things that revolutionized women's perceptions of sex. The first one was the pill, or women's first contraceptive. The second one was Helen Gurley Brown's book, Sex and the Single Girl. These two things combined introduced, but for some reinforced, the idea that even ladies can have sex before marriage. In fact, according to a Gallup poll taken in May of 2012, 89% of American adults think that contraceptives and premarital sex are morally acceptable. In the 70s, change came for women through legislature. In 1972, Title IX was passed. It was the bill that prohibited discrimination based on gender in any program funded by the federal government. Or, if a school had a boys' basketball team, it had to have a girls'. This led to a widespread acceptance of women athletes, which led to a new perspective on what ladies looked like. No longer were they fragile and delicate. They were now strong, powerful, and athletic. In the 80s, women were entering the workforce in hordes, and they were asking for something they wouldn't have dared 10 years prior: executive positions in successful companies. And all of this was in spite of the fact that ERA never passed. ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, was the bill that would have prohibited men from being paid more than women for the same job. According to the New York Times segment on the new gender divide, this was most likely because today, more women than men attend college, thus making them want to go on and have their own careers. According to Derek Flasberg, in his book, Classy, How to Be an Exceptionally Modern Lady in an Exceptionally Modern World, today, independent, hard-working women are now accepted as perfectly normal, and thus, the independent woman is now a lady. Now, I'm not the most motherly. I'm not great at cooking, and I'm certainly not good at cleaning. So that makes me really glad that the definition of being a lady has changed since the 19th century. First, we took a look at the 19th century, what made a woman a lady then. Secondly, we looked at the early 20th century and the requisites for being a lady, and we finish up with the classifications of being a lady in the late 20th century to today. Now, I am certainly glad I'm not wearing a corset right now. I'm ecstatic that as a woman, I can vote. I'm thankful that I can decide when I'm ready for marriage. I'm anxious to get a job. And today, all of those things make me and you